In the heart of the American winter wilderness, a seasoned hunter realizes too late that something desperate is stalking him through the snow. His rifle fails in the cold, his matches freeze solid, and darkness gathers like a living force around the trees. Somewhere behind him, a starving mountain lion waits for the moment his guard drops. The mountains offer no warnings, only consequences. By sunrise, survival itself will be rewritten. The basin he crossed was one of those wide, high ridges where sound disappeared almost instantly. The cold swallowed footfalls, wind sculpted patterns across the crust, leaving drifts that rose and sank like frozen waves. Calder traveled with the careful balance of a man who understood how fragile everything could become when winter reached its final, unforgiving stretch. He carried a pack roughly 30 pounds in weight, heavy with traps, supplies, and the thick wool blanket he trusted more than any modern invention. His rifle rode across his shoulder, its metal chilled but reliable. Or so he believed.
Calder had left camp before dawn, following a route he'd taken dozens of times. He noted the signs that marked his progress, the way the frost lifted like smoke from the valley floor, the shape of the wind near the ridge, the soft groan of trees bearing too much snow. Yet something felt subtly altered. The mountains often carried messages that had to be sensed rather than heard. Even long before trouble came into view, the land whispered it. When Calder found the first set of tracks, he stopped so sharply that ice cracked beneath his boots. The prints were spaced just a little too wide, the toe marks pointed, the depth suggesting a creature with real weight, a mountain lion close to 120 pounds at least. Not fresh, not old, somewhere in that uncertain window that meant caution. He crouched near the print, studying the snow pressed down into a firm oval. The edges softened by wind told him the animal had passed an hour earlier, maybe a bit more. He didn't see it, he didn't hear it, but something in the back of his mind began to weigh the distance between hunter and hunted. Still, Calder felt no real fear. He had seen lions before and outsmarted them through patience and positioning. They avoided conflict unless starvation stripped them of their natural restraint. It happened rarely, but late winter had a way of pushing everything toward its limit. Even so, Calder kept moving, following the basin toward the darker timber that marked his descent. By midday, he paused to check the condition of his gear. The cold was harsher than the previous days, a sharp drop of nearly 15 degrees since dawn. Metal contracted in weather like this, but his rifle had always survived such conditions without complaint. He ran a gloved finger along the barrel, checking for frost buildup, then lowered it carefully. Snowfall had thickened in the last hour, dry and powder fine, the kind that sifted into clothing seams and clung to eyelashes. As he approached the narrow cut leading into the timberline, the mountain's mood shifted again. Wind settled, silence deepened, a stillness formed around him that didn't feel natural. Calder noticed the second set of tracks before he meant to. These were fresher, maybe 30 minutes old. The spacing had changed, too. Shorter, slower. The signs of a predator pacing its distance rather than moving with confidence. Hunger changed the geometry of movement. The prince pressed down a little deeper here, revealing a body weakened yet determined. A flicker of concern passed through him. A starving lion was unpredictable in ways that experience couldn't always solve. Still, he kept his pace measured. Panic shortened judgment, and in the wilderness, poor judgment shortened life. Calder neared the line of pines when the first hint of trouble reached him, not through sight or sound, but through the rifle. He raised it instinctively when a crow cawed overhead, hoping to test the action. The trigger felt stiff. He squeezed. A thin, metallic crack snapped into the air. Not loud, not dangerous, just wrong. A misfire, the kind that could happen when moisture froze inside the lock. Calder checked the mechanism, capping the side lightly. Nothing moved the way it should. The cold had bitten deeper than he expected. This failure didn't frighten him, but it shifted the stakes. A frozen rifle meant fewer options, and in these mountains, fewer options meant thinner margins. Calder knew he'd need warmth to thaw the lock safely. A small fire, a bit of dry tinder, nothing major, something he'd solved dozens of times. He unbuttoned his coat pocket to reach for the small tin that held his matches. When he opened the tin, his heart sank, not because the situation was dire yet, but because it suddenly could become. The matches glinted under the pale winter light, their heads fractured with a thin frost crust. The extreme cold had split the compound that made them reliable. Every stick lay brittle and ruined. No spark. No chance of ignition. Not without hours of friction work he didn't have time for. Calder closed the tin slowly. The snowfall around him softened the world to a muted hush. He felt the same pressure many frontiermen had described, an awareness that the mountain had begun testing him in earnest. He assessed his surroundings again, noting the thickness of the timber, the narrowing light, and the way the wind carried a scent he couldn't immediately place. Not danger, not certainty, just presence. He scanned the ridgeline behind him. Nothing moved, yet he could feel the certainty forming. The lion hadn't abandoned its trail. It was simply waiting, watching, marking the moment when the balance between them shifted. A broken rifle, frozen matches, falling light, these things mattered to predators that lived on timing. He started forward again, steps measured, breathing steady. And as he crossed into the shadowed pines, the cold thickened around him like a warning, signaling that the next choice he made would determine the shape of the entire night to come. The cold had shifted from harsh to predatory by the time Calder Brand stepped deeper into the timber's shadow. The trees stood close here, their branches laden with snow that sagged like tired shoulders. The quiet grew heavier, settling into each space between trunks, muffling even the faintest wind. Calder knew that winter had moods, and this one had turned expectant, watchful, almost listening. His rifle hung in his grip like a silent reminder of everything the cold could ruin. The misfire from moments earlier replayed in his thoughts, not as panic, but as a calculated warning that the cold had crossed a threshold no hunter could ignore. He paused in the half-light beneath the pines, lifting the weapon with deliberate care. The metal felt even stiffer now, colder than the air around it, as if the rifle had become a part of the winter instead of a tool meant to resist it. Calder angled it toward a patch of open snow and tested the action again. Nothing yielded. No shift. No familiar click. The internal parts had seized, moisture locked into unmoving frost. A misfire could happen in extreme conditions, but a fully frozen lock meant the problem went deeper than a momentary failure. It meant his greatest advantage in the wilderness had turned uncertain. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath drift out in a cloud that hung in front of him longer than it should. The air was dropping in temperature again. He had seen nights where the cold claimed metal faster than thought, where even the strongest steel surrendered to the invisible pressure of ice forming in microscopic seams. This was one of those nights. Calder understood that a rifle in this state needed warmth, not a spark, not a brief flame, but sustained heat to loosen the lock's stiffened parts. He reached for his match tin again, even though he already knew what he would find. The broken, frost-split match heads stared back at him with a lifeless glitter. He held the tin in his palm for several seconds, as if waiting for the impossible, for the cold to relent, for the matches to behave as they always had, for the mountain to return to the predictable world he trusted. But the wilderness did not return what it had taken. He closed the tin carefully, slid it back into his pocket, and let the weight of the moment settle into his planning. No flame meant no direct heat. No heat meant the rifle would remain inoperable. And an inoperable rifle meant he had to rely on knowledge rather than gear. Calder had always respected how fast the mountains could change a situation. A few degrees, a misfire, a broken match, small things that seemed insignificant until they aligned in the wrong direction. He knelt beside a spruce trunk, brushing away a thin layer of snow to expose the frozen ground. He placed the rifle horizontally across his knees and examined the lock more closely. The frost was subtle, barely visible, more felt than seen. In warmer weather, he would have stripped the mechanism entirely to clear it, but here, in the failing light and falling temperature, disassembling the weapon risked losing a pin or spring in the snow, a mistake that could end the night before it really began. He had learned in the early years of his trapping life that some problems were solved not by force, but by timing. Moisture trapped inside a lock expanded when frozen, locking each movable piece in place. If he could raise the temperature of the metal by even 10 degrees, he might break the frost layer. He rubbed a gloved hand along the barrel, knowing the gesture offered no meaningful heat, but grounding his thoughts. He needed a plan that didn't involve fire, at least not yet. As Calder adjusted the rifle across his lap, he noticed something that sent a slight shift through his awareness. The silence was changing again. Not fully,
not dramatically, but enough for someone trained in the mountains to feel. Silence was never just silence in the backcountry. It carried stories, it carried direction, and now it carried pressure. He turned his head slightly, scanning between the pines. The shadows had grown longer, darker, stretched thin by the waning light. Somewhere beyond the nearest stand of trees, the feeling of being watched strengthened, as steady and quiet as breath on the back of the neck. He rose to his feet with controlled movement, slipping the rifle over his shoulder. The weight felt different when it wasn't functional, a burden rather than a tool. Yet he needed it still. Even broken, a rifle could serve as a shield, a lever, a signal of presence. He started forward again, listening for the subtle sounds predators made when hunger outweighed caution. A starving mountain lion rarely behaved with its usual patience. It might pace, circle, test ground, hesitate. Hunger turned deliberate stalkers into restless shadows. Calder moved slowly, keeping his steps steady and evenly spaced, knowing sudden motion could spark a chase instinct. He inspected the snow ahead, searching for new prints. It didn't take long. Just beyond a fallen log lay a fresh track, its edges crisp, its shape unmistakable. The lion was closer now, perhaps only 20 minutes ahead or 20 minutes behind. The direction was unclear, but the proximity was undeniable. He studied the imprint carefully. The depth suggested weakened strength, but the spacing implied determination. A predator in decline physically did not necessarily decline mentally. Hunger sharpened focus. He continued along the narrow timber path, following the natural dips of the land where the snow was thinner. His breath echoed softly in his hood as he weighed each decision. He needed shelter soon, not for rest, but for strategic positioning, a place where he could monitor movement, limit ambush angles, and buy time to work on the rifle if warmth could be found from another source. Trees alone wouldn't be enough. The forest offered concealment for him, but even more for the lion. The timber gradually opened onto a gentle slope where pockets of starlight filtered through the thinning crowns. Calder paused again, letting his eyes adjust. The cold bit deeper, settling through layers of wool and canvas, pressing against his ribs like a tightening band. He had felt cold before, bitter cold, punishing cold. But this was different. This cold wanted decisions, it wanted movement, it wanted mistakes. He understood that predators sensed weakness, but the wilderness itself sensed it too. As Calder adjusted his packstrap, a faint sound drifted through the trees behind him. Not a growl, not a snap of branches, just a soft, almost delicate shift of weight on snow. A single step, calculated and quiet. He didn't turn immediately. He stared ahead for a long heartbeat, letting the sound settle in his mind. The lion was no longer simply tracking him, it was studying him. He finally turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing into the timber. He saw nothing, but he didn't need evidence. Presence was enough. He tightened the grip on the useless rifle, knowing its condition mattered far less than the knowledge of how to move through a situation like this. The cold had taken his fire. The cold had seized his weapon, but it had not taken his judgment. And as he stepped into a deeper stretch of shadow with the understanding that the balance of the night had shifted entirely, he knew that the next sound he heard would determine more than his path. It would determine his chances of making it out of the timber at all. Calder Brand stepped into a deeper quiet as the last threads of daylight thinned across the timber. The cold had changed again, settling into a brittle stillness that felt more like a held breath than a natural pause. Snow filtered down from the high branches in slow spirals, drifting through slanted beams of the fading sun. What had begun as a routine crossing had shifted into a tightening maze of narrowing options. The failure of his rifle lingered in his thoughts, but the frozen matches troubled him more. Fire was more than warmth in the wilderness. It was control, clarity, and the one force predators respected at a distance. He walked until the trees opened slightly, revealing a shallow depression where snow had gathered in smooth, unbroken layers. Calder stopped there, letting his pack slide gently from his shoulders. The weight hit the ground with a muted thump that vanished into the snow's silence. He crouched beside it, unfastening the top flap with slow, deliberate movements. He needed to assess everything he had left, not for comfort, but for strategy. This night would require strategy more than strength. Every decision mattered twice over in temperatures this low. He dug through the pack carefully, pulling out his small fire kit as if hoping something inside had survived the cold's relentless grip. The metal tin holding his matches felt colder than the snow beneath him. He opened it with a steady hand, exposing the brittle collection he had already seen in the ridgelight earlier. Each match head looked as if frost had seeped into it, creating tiny fractures along the sulfur. He tested one between his fingers, pressing lightly. It crumbled almost immediately, falling apart like the shell of a frozen berry. No flame could rise from a match that fragile. Calder rested his elbows on his knees, letting the reality settle without frustration. The wilderness didn't bend to frustration. It bent only to understanding and calm adjustment, two things he had cultivated through years of mountain winters. He studied the frozen matches again, not with despair, but with curiosity. He knew how matches failed in cold this severe. Moisture trapped within the match head expanded as it froze, fracturing the structure until it broke apart at even the slightest pressure. Frontier travelers had warned one another about such failures, but warnings were softer than the real thing. Observation was always clearer than memory. He closed the tin and slipped it back into his pocket, then reached for the small leather pouch that held his emergency tinder. Inside lay curls of dry bark he had collected months earlier, strands of fibrous root, and a thin sliver of fat wood. These materials could catch sparks, but sparks meant friction or steel. Friction required time, stillness, and a warm core temperature. Steel required an operational striker and a steady hand. He had both, but the cold was sinking deeper into his shoulders and arms, pushing small tremors into muscles that needed precision. Calder knew he could create fire through effort alone if he had to, yet the timing troubled him. The lion's presence was no longer a vague possibility. The fresh tracks, the measured patterns of pacing, the weight in the silence, all of it pointed toward a predator that had decided this night carried opportunity. A starving mountain lion seldom acted with haste. It tested, watched, and waited for missteps. Calder didn't intend to give it any. He repacked the tinder pouch, making sure it remained dry, then tightened every strap on his pack before rising again. He moved through the timber toward an area with younger spruces, knowing they offered better shelter from wind, but also held more shadow. The darkness beneath the branches grew thicker with every step. The last light of afternoon clung to the treetops, leaving the forest floor in muted grays that softened edges and obscured distance. Calder moved with caution, lifting his boots high to avoid breaking crusted snow that might echo too sharply. He wasn't trying to hide from the lion. It already knew exactly where he was, but he didn't intend to communicate panic through careless noise. As he walked, he kept replaying the slow crumble of the match head, not as a fear, but as an essential clue. If the matches failed this quickly, the temperature was likely lower than he estimated, likely below -20 degrees Fahrenheit by now. Cold like that drained energy faster than most men realized. A steady, focused mind could manage the night, but a body exposed too long would begin to fail without warning. Calder needed a solution before the cold began dictating his choices instead of his judgment. He reached a slight rise where the trees parted just enough to reveal a thin sweep of sky. A single star blinked faintly in the distance, signaling that dusk had begun its final descent. He stopped there, inhaling slowly and deeply as he surveyed the land around him. The snow carried no new tracks in the immediate clearing, but the forest's silence still felt pointed. That steady, observing pressure hadn't lifted. The lion was near, not close enough to see yet, but close enough to feel. Calder's thoughts shifted from the problem of fire to the problem of positioning. He needed a place where he could gather tinder, stay alert, and prepare for the long night without giving the lion easy opportunity to close distance unseen. Younger spruces offered cover, but their tight spacing made visibility difficult. Older pines offered sight lines, but less wind protection. He walked a slow circle around the clearing, choosing a spot where a fallen tree lay at an angle, providing a bit of natural windbreak without compromising his view. He set his pack down once more and examined the bark curls in his tinder pouch. They were still dry enough to catch a spark if he could produce one. He pulled out his steel striker and held it in his gloved hand, testing the movement of his fingers. The cold had begun to stiffen them, but not enough to prevent work. He struck the steel once against a piece of flint, watching the tiny spark leap into the air before dying in the snow. That spark told him two things. The steel was still functional, and the night could still be shaped by effort rather than luck. He began gathering more tinder, breaking thin branches from deadfall and shaving off small curls of wood with his knife. He moved quietly, but with purpose. He avoided the deep shadows where sound felt trapped. His senses sharpened with each minute, attuned to faint shifts in the forest's rhythm. The snow beneath him carried the soft crunch of his boots, a sound that felt louder than it should in the stillness. Every now and then he paused to listen, turning his head slightly without moving his body. The forest remained quiet, but not empty. When he had enough tinder to attempt ignition, he paused again, glancing around the tree line. Something in the silence had changed. The quiet wasn't simply heavy now, it was layered, intentional. The kind of quiet that suggested a presence waiting for the right moment. Calder felt it settle on his shoulders like a weight. He didn't see the lion, but he didn't need to. The pattern was too clear. The predator had moved again, closer, slower, more deliberate. He tucked the tinder pouch back into his pack without striking another spark. Fire would have to wait until he could choose a safer moment. A flame in the wrong place could draw the lion in instead of warding it off. Calder knew the difference between strategy and impulse, and instinct guided him now with more certainty than tools ever could. He slung his pack onto his back once more, tightening every strap until the weight sat close against him. The cold deepened, the sky darkened, and the forest closed its shadows around the narrow space where he stood. The night had begun pressing him toward decisions that would shape everything ahead. And as he stepped forward into the thickening dusk, he sensed that the next sound he encountered would not come from the wind, but from the living hunger following quietly through the trees. Calder Bran moved deeper into the timber where the dusk pooled thickly between the trees, turning every shape into a shifting silhouette. The cold had settled into a harsher, drier stillness, the kind that stripped moisture from the air until breath floated like pale smoke and vanished almost immediately. The forest felt tighter now, as if the trees themselves leaned inward to listen. He walked with the controlled steps of someone measuring not just distance, but consequence. The frozen matches had taken fire from him. The locked rifle had taken easy defense, and now a heavier realization pressed into his thoughts. The lion was no longer merely following him, it had begun circling. He paused near a cluster of old pines where the ground sloped downward into a shadowed hollow. Snow lay deep here, at least 10 inches in places where wind had carved channels. Calder crouched and touched the surface lightly. It was cold enough to squeak under his fingertips, a sign of temperatures well below zero. He shifted his gaze across the hollow, noticing disturbances in the powder. They were subtle but unmistakable. Tracks where the snow had compacted under weight and then crusted over again from the dropping temperature. The spacing told a clear story. Whatever had passed through had been pausing often, pacing its movements instead of traveling with purpose. A lion's pattern changed when hunger drove caution into obsession. He studied the nearest print, noting the depth and the faint drag at the heel. That drag wasn't weakness, it was focus. A starving lion conserved energy by planting each step carefully, moving slower and lower to the ground. Calder let his breath settle and he traced the line of prints with his eyes. They weren't coming directly towards him. They were sweeping in a wide arc, roughly 40 yards beyond the slope. The circle had begun. Predators in late winter often tested distance rather than territory, watching for inconsistency or hesitation. Hunger sharpened their instincts to an almost eerie precision. They learned patterns of breath, rhythm of footsteps, the slight changes in posture that revealed exhaustion or uncertainty. Calder rose slowly, adjusting his pack strap. He turned his head slightly towards the forest silently, sensing that somewhere just beyond the next stand of trees, the lion watched with the same deliberate stillness. Animals driven by hunger often abandoned the patient grace they were known for, but they never lost awareness. The mountain lion had likely been living off scraps for days, maybe longer. In this season, deer moved lower, smaller prey hid under deeper snow, and the predator's energy reserves thinned rapidly. A lion that needed roughly 800 to 1,000 calories a day could burn through that energy just by stalking. Calder understood that hunger made predators both cautious and relentless. He continued down the slope, choosing a path that curved along the edge of the hollow. The snow was deeper here, but the terrain gave him better sightlines. He needed to understand how close the lion was, not by seeing it, but by reading the forest itself. He watched the trees carefully, noticing how the branches shifted under the faint pressure of settling snow. When something heavier than snow moved through the brush, trees reacted differently. The pattern of sway was more deliberate, more weighted. Calder focused on these small shifts, allowing them to guide his understanding of the lion's path. He stopped when he reached a fallen pine lying at an angle against a cluster of younger trees. The trunk was wide enough to offer slight cover, but more importantly, it provided a vantage point. He rested his hand lightly on the rough bark and listened. The forest carried a layered quiet, a stillness interrupted only by the soft tick of ice forming on pine needles and the occasional settling sigh of snow drifting off branches. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds lived something else, something subtle, a faint rhythm of movement, a controlled inhale, a careful placement of weight on snow. He felt it more than he heard it, the way one senses an approaching storm before it arrives. Calder let his gaze sweep the tree line again. He saw nothing, but visibility was not the measure here. Presence was. He knew the lion had likely closed its circle, shifting from one side of him to the other in a slow, methodical arc. Predators in this state didn't rush. They waited for darkness to finish what hunger had begun. Calder checked the sky through the break in the canopy. Dusk had almost merged with night, and once the last light faded, the forest would turn into a maze where shadow and shape blended too easily. He weighed his options carefully. Staying in the hollow would offer shelter from the wind, but limited visibility. Moving uphill toward the thicker pines would grant sightlines at the cost of wind exposure. Calder chose the slight ascent, knowing that positioning mattered more than comfort. A higher line of sight could tell him whether the lion intended to keep circling or begin closing. He stepped uphill slowly, testing each patch of snow for noise. Even a single misstep could shift the predator's calculations. As he climbed, the feeling of being watched deepened. He sensed the lion's focus like a narrow beam of pressure following him across the slope. Predators in starvation mode behaved differently. Their attention didn't drift, they didn't lose interest. They became locked onto possibilities with an almost unsettling precision. Calder had read signs of lions before, but this one carried a different intent. It was not guarding territory or defending cubs. It was not curious or cautious. It was calculating. At the top of the rise, he stopped beside a pine whose branches fanned wide enough to offer some shelter, but not enough to obstruct his view. He rested his pack against the trunk and let his breathing steady. The cold was beginning to settle deeper into his core now, and he resisted the temptation to flex his fingers or shift too much weight from one boot to the other. Movement communicated more than scent. Stillness communicated strength. He scanned the hollow once more, letting his eyes adjust to the deepening dark. The snow reflected faint light from the sky, creating a pale glow across the basin. He caught a subtle change in the pattern, an indentation in the snow that hadn't been there earlier. Not movement, not a full shape, but a suggestion, a soft depression where something had paused, then slipped behind a cluster of trees. The lion was closer now, likely within 50 yards, maintaining its careful arc. Calder let the knowledge settle without fear. He wasn't afraid. He felt the pressure of the moment, yes, but fear clouded thinking, and thinking was his strongest advantage. He tightened his grip on the useless rifle slung across his shoulder. Even in its current state, it served as a reminder of discipline and training, two things no amount of cold could strip him from. The light continued to fade, and with it the forest shifted into a stage where sound mattered more than sight. Calder listened for patterns, 3 steps and a pause, a slow shift of weight, the deliberate patience of a predator waiting for darkness to blur the line between distance and opportunity. The cold deepened further, pressing into his skin, urging faster decisions, but he resisted. Timing mattered now more than ever. He stepped away from the pine, ready to move toward the old trapper shelter he remembered farther downslope. He had passed it seasons ago, a small, weathered structure that might offer the advantage of walls and narrow entry points. It was his next move, but he knew reaching it would require crossing through a corridor the lion might already be examining. And as the forest around him settled into the beginnings of full night, he sensed that the predator's patience was nearing its final measure, waiting for the moment when darkness would tip the balance in its favor and close the circle it had begun hours earlier.
Gulderbrand descended the gentle ridge with a measured pace, each step pressing into snow that had grown denser with the dropping temperature. The forest around him thickened into deeper shades of dusk, the light narrowing into smaller pockets where only thin slivers of sky remained visible. The cold pressed against him with a steadier force now, not in sharp gusts, but in a continuous sinking weight that clung to his clothing and settled against his skin. He kept his breath controlled, exhaling slowly through tightened lips so the condensation wouldn't billow too widely. In a wilderness this silent, even breath could feel like a signal. The lion had not shown itself, yet Calder sensed it threading through the forest's darker channels, still circling, still calculating, waiting for night to ripen into full advantage. Ahead, the faint line of the slope curved downward toward a patch of older timber. Somewhere in that direction lay the remnants of an old trapper shelter, a structure he had passed seasons earlier but never occupied. Back then, it seemed like a relic, leaning awkwardly against the elements, with its sagging ridgepole and half-collapsed walls. Tonight, it represented one of the few places where he could control angles, visibility, and exposure. The forest granted no level ground suitable for a steady stance, and the snowdrifts nearby created blind pockets where a predator could slip unseen. Shelter meant structure, and structure meant strategic opportunity. He moved toward the darker stand of trees, adjusting the weight of his pack and keeping the broken rifle slung across his shoulder. The weapon held no promise of firing, but it remained a tool, something to brace, something to leverage, something that symbolized readiness even in its useless state. The air around him had grown so still that the crunch of his boots on the crusted snow sounded unnervingly sharp. He slowed his steps, testing each patch of ground before shifting his weight fully. Late winter forests were delicate in ways few understood. The snow transmitted vibration differently when predators lingered nearby. Sound traveled farther, sharper, more intentionally. At the base of the slope, Calder reached a cluster of young spruces where the trunks were narrow and closely spaced. Their branches dipped low, creating a curtain of shadow that he pushed through carefully. Beyond them, the older timber opened into a small clearing with uneven snow. The shelter lay at the far edge, half hidden beneath the leaning skeletons of downed branches. Even from a distance it looked fragile, an angled shape of splintered logs, weathered bark, and wind-worn joints. But it also looked like a starting point. He approached slowly, scanning the snow around the structure for tracks. Nothing fresh lay near the shelter itself, but the forest's silence still carried that watchful stillness. The clearing's openness worked to his advantage. Though exposure increased, sightlines stretched farther, giving him a wider view of possible approaches. He crouched near the old structure and studied it with the pragmatic mind of someone accustomed to repairing rather than discarding. The roof leaned inward where the center beam sagged under years of snow load. The sidewalls had shifted but remained mostly upright, and the back portion pressed against a natural rise in the ground that shielded it from direct wind. Calder tested the nearest log with a firm press of his palm. It held, though it creaked softly under the pressure. He stepped inside, examining how much weight the remaining structure could support. The interior was narrow, low, and uneven, but it significantly reduced the wind's bite. The smell of old wood and cold earth filled the cramped space. This shelter wasn't built to offer comfort, it was built to offer survival. Even in its splintered state, it still carried the rough geometry of necessity. He knew he couldn't count on the structure alone. The walls required reinforcement. If he was going to spend part of the night here, he needed to secure the weak points. He stepped back outside and surveyed the fallen timber scattered around the clearing. Several branches were too brittle to be of use, but a few solid pieces lay half buried beneath the snow. He pulled his gloves tighter and began clearing the snow away from the logs, selecting those that could be used to fortify the lean-to without compromising movement or visibility. The work wasn't fast, but speed wasn't the priority. Doing it quietly mattered more. Calder lifted each log with controlled steadiness, dragging them into position along the shelter's vulnerable side. He built a rough grid of support beams, slotting them beneath the sagging ridgepole and leaning them diagonally against the walls to absorb some of the snow load.
The cracks in the old wood whispered faintly with each adjustment, and he paused often to listen, not to the structure, but to the forest. The lion had not broken its silence, yet silence itself often carried clues: the absence of wind, the steadiness of shadows, the faint, almost imperceptible feeling of pressure from somewhere unseen. After reinforcing the shelter, Calder stepped back and evaluated his work. The structure wouldn't withstand a heavy storm, but it would hold through the night. He positioned his pack inside, choosing a spot where he could reach it quickly while still having enough space to move. Inside the shelter, he had one advantage the forest didn't offer: a narrow view of the clearing through a small gap in the logs, a line of sight that allowed him to monitor the trees without exposing himself unnecessarily. But fire was still a lingering issue. He had the means to create friction-based ignition, but friction required conditions he didn't currently have: a stable surface, enough warmth to maintain dexterity, and time uninterrupted by movement in the forest. He could attempt it, but a false start would waste precious energy, and energy mattered more than comfort right now. Winter survival often hinged on restraint rather than action. Knowing when not to push was as important as knowing when to move. Calder crouched near the entrance, running through silent calculations. The night would grow darker soon. The lion would shift from circling to positioning. Hunger always followed a sequence, and late winter predators learned to conserve energy until the moment required a burst of commitment. He understood the pattern well. The shelter gave him structural advantage, but it did not eliminate risk. The predator would test the boundaries of the clearing, moving closer with each pass, attempting to find the angle where darkness blurred its shape into the forest floor. He leaned against one of the reinforced walls, letting his breathing settle again. His pulse steadied, controlled and deliberate. This shelter, fragile as it was, grounded him. It gave him focus. The lion might continue circling for hours, seeking the moment when sound, shadow, or stillness shifted in its favor. But Calder was not inexperienced. He recognized that hunger shaped predators into uncanny observers, but he had lived through enough winters to understand how hunger shaped humans too, not towards recklessness, but towards clarity. He listened again, letting the forest's patterns filter into his awareness: the distant creak of ice on branches, the faint thud of settling snow, and beneath those small natural sounds, something different. A pause that didn't belong to the forest, a shift of weight on snow too controlled to be accidental. The lion had moved again, adjusting its approach. Calder lowered his head slightly, not in fear, but in calculation. The night had not yet fully tightened its grip, but the pattern of movement told him something unmistakable. The shelter had bought him time, not safety. The predator had begun studying the clearing with renewed purpose, drawn not by noise, but by the single undeniable truth that hunger sharpened every instinct. And as the last amber of daylight slipped behind the ridge, leaving the forest wrapped in a rising tide of blue-black shadow, Calder sensed that the moment when the lion tested the edge of the clearing was drawing nearer, carried quietly on the breath of the coming night. Night settled across the clearing with a slow, deliberate weight, deepening the shadows until even the familiar shapes of trees began to blend into one another. Calder Bran remained inside the reinforced lean-to, the structure creaking faintly as temperature continued to fall. The cold had become denser, sharper, almost granular in the way it pressed against his face and seeped through layers of wool. He knew this phase of the night well, when the air grew so brittle that sound traveled farther and the forest seemed to shrink around every breath. It was the hour when hunger-driven predators grew bold, when even the most disciplined hunter felt instinct rising like a second heartbeat. Calder steadied that instinct, refusing to let urgency disturb the clarity he needed. The shelter protected him from wind, but not from the creeping freeze that tried to settle into every joint and muscle. He needed warmth, even the smallest ember, to keep dexterity alive and mind alert. But fire in this clearing came with risk. Flame could anchor him, but it could also draw the lion closer. Predators noticed shifts in scent, changes in sound, the snap of branches when heat released hidden moisture. Calder had survived too many winters to overlook that. Yet without some form of controlled heat, the night could turn against him long before the lion made any decision at all. He reached slowly for his pack, fingers stiff but still purposeful. Inside, wrapped in a strip of oiled cloth, lay the last piece of fatwood he had carried since early winter. He had rationed it carefully, keeping it dry and protected through storms and sudden freezes. Fatwood burned longer and brighter than bark curls or tinder scraps. It was the lifeline men used when the cold had bitten deep enough to silence all other options. Using it now meant gambling with the one resource he could never replace tonight. But the cold, sharpening with each passing minute, demanded a choice. Calder unwrapped the fatwood carefully, its resin-rich surface catching the faint glimmer of dusklight leaking through the gap in the shelter wall. He studied it the way a craftsman examines an irreplaceable tool, understanding its potential, its limits, and its cost. The lion's presence had not lifted. If anything, its stillness felt more concentrated now, as though the animal had settled into a patient crouch somewhere beyond the clearing's edge. Hunger often brought predators into a strange, suspended calm, a state where every sense sharpened, but every movement slowed. Calder knew this was not the hour of confrontation, but the hour of decisions that shaped confrontation. He placed the fatwood gently on a flat piece of bark beside him, then pulled out his striker and flint. Creating an ember required more than sparks. It required consistency, rhythm, and the ability to remain aware of the forest around him while focusing on the task before him. He angled the flint and steel, testing the grip of his stiffening fingers. He struck once, a soft spark flickering against the fatwood shavings, but dying before catching. He exhaled quietly, letting the rhythm settle. He struck a second time, the spark landing closer, clinging briefly before fading. On the third strike, a small ember formed, faint, red, and precarious. Calder leaned over it slowly, shielding it with his palm while coaxing it into the bark curls. The ember pulsed twice, then caught faintly, a fragile glow that signaled possibility. The warmth was almost imperceptible at first, but heat had presence even in small amounts. Calder felt the ember strengthen, subtle but real. He fed it with controlled shifts of fatwood shavings, careful not to smother it. The faint glow reflected against the interior logs of the shelter, creating flickers that moved like small, hesitant breaths. He allowed himself a single moment to acknowledge the progress, not relief, but understanding. Heat would keep him alert, alertness would keep him alive. As the ember grew, the resin in the fatwood released its distinct sharp scent, a mixture of pine and sap that carried farther in cold air. Calder froze briefly, recognizing how quickly scent could travel in stillness like this. Predators detected changes in scent faster than changes in sound. He adjusted the angle of the bark to contain as much fragrance as possible inside the shelter, though he knew nothing concealed entirely. The lion would sense the shift, but sensing was different from engaging. Fire altered the psychology of predators, even hungry ones. It created hesitation. That hesitation formed space, and space was something Calder needed.
The ember expanded into a small flame, no larger than the width of 2 fingers, but bright enough to cast delicate shadows across the snow outside the shelter entrance. Calder leaned close, warming his hands carefully. The heat seeped into his fingers, restoring some flexibility. It wasn't enough to thaw the rifle lock fully, but it brought him clarity, and clarity mattered more than firepower at this moment. He listened again, letting the forest's patterns settle around him. For several minutes, nothing shifted. Then the silence changed in a subtle but unmistakable way, an adjustment of weight, softer than wind, slower than falling snow. The lion had repositioned. Calder didn't move. The flame danced gently, its light bouncing across the rough interior walls. Outside the shelter, the clearing remained still, yet the stillness no longer felt neutral. It had shape now, a boundary defined by 2 beings, one waiting for opportunity, the other shaping it. Calder knew predators could detect warmth even without light. They felt changes in temperature through the air. This small flame had become both resource and signal. A faint sound drifted from the left side of the clearing, a soft press of weight into snow, measured and careful. The lion was testing again, evaluating the shelter, the light, the shift in scent.
Hunger had pushed it past easy caution, but not past strategy. Calder could feel its presence tightening, studying the boundary between risk and reward. He watched the flame with steady eyes, aware of how small and fragile it was, yet how much power it carried within this frozen landscape. It was more than fire. It was a declaration of readiness. And as the ember's glow strengthened into a thin but steady flame, Calder sensed that the moment the light revealed what the lion had been waiting for was drawing near, shaping the next turn of the night with quiet, inevitable precision. Calder Bran stayed near the small, steady flame, aware that even the faintest warmth felt amplified in the brittle cold of late winter night. The fat wood he had coaxed into life was no larger than a thumb-length flame, yet it cast shimmering strokes of orange across the inside of the lean-to, sending thin shadows crawling along the fractured logs. The heat reached only a few inches from its source, but it was enough to keep his fingers responsive, enough to pull him back from the creeping numbness that threatened reaction and reason. Outside, the clearing remained unnervingly still. The lion's presence pressed against the silence like a slow-moving storm, patient, focused, and waiting for the smallest shift in the night's rhythm. Calder knew he could not rely on the flame for long. The fat wood he carried was limited, and the ember would need more feeding than he could afford to give. Fire brought him clarity, not safety. Safety in a night like this depended on positioning, planning, and turning disadvantage into function. His rifle lay beside him, its metal still stiff with cold, the lock frozen beyond use. But as he studied it in the flickering light, the shape of a different possibility began forming. A non-firing rifle still held value, its length, its balance, its weight. Every tool in the wilderness had more than one purpose, and every purpose evolved under pressure. He picked up the rifle, feeling its cold steel against his palm. The barrel remained straight, firm, and solid, designed to withstand harsh weather and hard knocks. The shoulder stock, worn smooth from years of use, had a sturdiness that could anchor strength. Calder turned the weapon slowly, examining its length and angles. The rifle had become dead weight in terms of firing, but not in terms of leverage. With the right adjustment, it could serve as an extension of his reach, a tool of positioning rather than force. He didn't need impact to deter a predator. He needed strategy, distance, and focus. He shifted the rifle in his hands, testing the balance as he would test a staff. The weight distribution was slightly forward heavy, the barrel longer than ideal for precise maneuvering, but its rigidity could offer stability. He wrapped his fingers around the base where the stock met the metal, feeling the contours that allowed for a steady grip. The idea of converting a broken rifle into a controlled defensive tool was not new. Old hunters had spoken of such improvisations when recounting narrow escapes. Yet Calder wasn't interested in copying an old method. He needed something shaped for this moment, for this clearing, for the predator watching from somewhere outside the lean-to. He knelt closer to the flame, warming the stock slightly so his hands wouldn't slip against the cold. The heat seeped into the wood, making it easier to hold. He positioned the rifle vertically before angling it slightly forward, visualizing how he might use it to create space, redirect movement, or maintain a boundary between himself and the lion without escalating tension. This was not a weapon for striking. It was a tool for guiding angles and altering approach paths. The lion would not rush without cause. Hunger made predators cautious, not reckless. Calder's tool needed to match that balance. He stepped out of the shelter with slow deliberation, keeping the rifle angled downward, but ready. The night outside had darkened into a near-complete blue-black shadow. Only the faint shimmer from the ember behind him cast a thin glow across the snow at the entrance. The cold hit him immediately, seeping through his coat with a force that felt almost physical. He breathed evenly, controlling the rhythm, allowing each exhale to disappear quickly into the night. The clearing appeared unchanged, but the silence felt weighted again, indicating the lion had shifted position. Calder moved a few steps from the shelter, testing the rifle's reach in the open air. The snow crackled softly beneath his boots. The weapon, though frozen, responded predictably, offering the distance he needed. He turned slightly towards the trees on the northern edge of the clearing, where shadows seemed to gather more deeply. He sensed movement, not a sound, not a shape, but a pressure in the cold air that made the hairs along the back of his neck rise. It wasn't fear, but recognition. Predators often reveal presence through atmosphere before visibility. He lowered the rifle again, holding it diagonally so he could raise it smoothly if needed. He scanned the clearing, allowing his eyes to adjust slowly, resisting the instinct to look too quickly. Rapid head movements sometimes signaled distress to predators. Calm, steady scanning conveyed readiness. Calder practiced the method he had learned long ago: steady breaths, controlled posture, wide vision without direct fixation. The forest rewarded stillness. Stillness communicated strength.
The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it a faint rustle from the east. Calder's focus tightened. He turned his head subtly, enough to acknowledge the direction, but not enough to provoke response. Hunger-driven lions approached differently from territorial ones. Their steps were softer, more measured, each movement calculated to conserve dwindling energy. Calder felt that pattern now, sensed the lion's careful approach, the quiet evaluation happening just beyond the line of trees. He returned to the shelter entrance, positioning the rifle across his lap as he sat with his back to one of the reinforced logs. From here, he could monitor both the clearing and the surrounding timber without sacrificing warmth. The small flame continued to burn behind him, faint but steady, casting delicate waves of light across the snow. He adjusted the fat wood slowly, feeding only what was necessary to maintain the ember. Any sudden brightening might draw the lion closer with curiosity or desperation. The seconds stretched into long, quiet minutes. Calder remained still, letting the night unfold around him. A subtle shift in the atmosphere made him straighten slightly, an almost imperceptible change in the rhythm of silence. Something had paused at the clearing's edge. He didn't turn immediately. Instead, he let his breath slow even more, attuning his senses to the temperature, the faint vibrations in the ground, the air pressure surrounding him. Then it came, a soft, deliberate crunch in the snow. Not loud, not quick, just enough to confirm presence. The lion had begun evaluating the shelter directly. It remained hidden, but its proximity had changed. Calder felt a line of understanding pass between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that the night had reached a new stage. The predator was no longer circling distantly, it was now studying the narrow gap between shadow and ember light where Calder sat. He lifted the rifle slightly, positioning it in front of him with slow intention. He wasn't preparing to strike, he was preparing to shape space, to guide movement, to remind the lion that distance still held meaning. The wilderness had no room for sudden aggression unless unavoidable. Restraint carried far more power here than force. The clearing remained silent, but the pressure in the air grew tighter, signaling that the lion was poised for its next decision. And just as Calder settled into readiness, the night broke with a sound that wasn't movement, wasn't breath, wasn't wind, something deeper, something that signaled the moment of hesitation between predator and prey had finally reached its edge. The night around the clearing had thickened into a deep, almost tangible stillness, the kind that felt layered rather than empty. Calder Brand remained near the lean-to, the broken rifle angled across his lap, its weight familiar yet repurposed. The ember behind him cast a faint, flickering glow along the floor of the shelter, the shadows stretching and contracting with each subtle shift of flame. The cold pressed harder now, sharp enough that each inhaled breath felt like a thin edge passing through his chest. Yet Calder didn't shift or fidget. Stillness was part of his calculation. Stillness kept his senses open, and stillness kept the predator cautious. He scanned the tree line with measured patience, letting his vision glide over the dark shapes rather than locking onto them. In the wilderness, direct focus sometimes sent signals an animal could interpret as challenge or fear. A wide, steady gaze communicated something more neutral, awareness without provocation.
The faint rustle he had heard moments earlier remained lodged in his mind, not as threat, but as confirmation. The lion was close, not in the open clearing, but in the corridor of trees where the dark pooled too deeply for shapes to hold definition. Calder adjusted his posture, drawing one knee slightly higher so he could shift balance quickly if needed. The rifle remained angled, its length an extension of his awareness rather than a weapon of force. The cold metal brushed against his glove, and he felt it as a reminder that improvisation shaped survival more often than perfect tools did. The flame behind him wavered once, sending a faint ripple of light outward. The movement illuminated the snow in a small arc at the entrance of the shelter before retreating again into the cramped space. He listened to the forest with a practiced stillness. Late winter nights had a rhythm that rarely changed. The creak of freezing branches, the sift of snow dropping from overloaded bows, the subtle groans of wood contracting under the cold. Tonight, those natural sounds carried a different undertone, a weighted expectation that didn't belong to the forest alone. Predators had a way of altering atmosphere simply by being present. Hunger amplified that presence into something sharper, more concentrated. Calder could feel that sharpened intent drifting through the tree line like a silent tide. A faint crunch broke the rhythm, a slow, measured press of weight into the crusted snow. Calder didn't turn his head. Instead, he let the sound settle in his thoughts. The lion wasn't advancing quickly. It was testing again, feeling the distance, gauging the gap between shadow and emberlight. The predator's patience had stretched long, but hunger rarely let it stretch forever. Calder sensed the shift in timing. Something about the night had reached its threshold, and he felt the moment in the air like a tightening rope. He lifted the rifle a few inches, positioning it diagonally across his chest. The movement was slow, deliberate, and without the slightest hint of tension. He kept his breathing measured, each inhale steady, each exhale quiet. The flame crackled softly behind him, releasing thin coils of scented smoke that lifted into the cold air. He didn't look back at it. Flames drew attention when watched too closely. Instead, he watched the space between the trees, where a faint distortion of darkness suggested movement. Not obvious, not linear, but present. Then, without warning, the forest's silence split. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't an explosion of sound. It was a sudden, dense shift of weight. Snow compressed in a single decisive motion. A whisper of speed, a rush of displaced air. Calder knew this moment well enough to recognize its nature instantly. For hours, the lion had circled, paced, considered. Hunger had kept it patient, cautious, aware. But hunger had also brought it to the edge of commitment. This sound marked that edge. A decision had been made. The charge began not with noise, but with momentum.
Calder felt it before he saw it, the air tightening, the faint tremble in the ground as something large moved with purpose. He didn't stand. Standing was too slow in deep snow. Instead, he shifted his weight forward, grounding his boots into the packed surface while raising the rifle into a ready angle. He didn't point it like a firearm. He oriented it like a barrier, a guide, something to shape the coming moment rather than fight it. A shadow broke the tree line, a swift disruption in the darkness that moved with a low, fluid motion. Calder didn't see details, only the silhouette of movement. The lion wasn't sprinting blindly. Its speed was tempered by calculation, navigating snow, angles, and distance with instinctive precision. This wasn't an attack driven by panic. It was an approach shaped by survival. Calder took a slow breath and tightened his grip on the rifle. The predator wasn't aiming straight for him. It was angling toward the clearing's edge, moving in a curved path that would allow it to test reaction before closing the gap. That arc mattered. It meant there was still space for influence. The wilderness demanded negotiation more than conflict. Predators often backed away from clear boundaries when those boundaries communicated confidence. He angled the rifle outward, aligning its length with the direction of the approaching shadow. The movement was smooth, controlled, without panic. The predator slowed. Calder felt the change more than he heard it.
Hunger pushed lions towards risk, but instinct taught them caution. The rifle's shape, unfamiliar though non-threatening. Calder felt it before he saw it, the air tightening, the faint tremble in the ground as something large moved with purpose. He didn't stand. Standing was too slow in deep snow. Instead, he shifted his weight forward, grounding his boots into the packed surface while raising the rifle into a ready angle. He didn't point it like a firearm. He oriented it like a barrier, a guide, something to shape the coming moment rather than fight it. A shadow broke the tree line, a swift disruption in the darkness that moved with a low, fluid motion. Calder didn't see details, only the silhouette of movement. The lion wasn't sprinting blindly. Its speed was tempered by calculation, navigating snow, angles, and distance with instinctive precision. This wasn't an attack driven by panic. It was an approach shaped by survival. Calder took a slow breath and tightened his grip on the rifle. The predator wasn't aiming straight for him. It was angling toward the clearing's edge, moving in a curved path that would allow it to test reaction before closing the gap. That arc mattered. It meant there was still space for influence. The wilderness demanded negotiation more than conflict. Predators often backed away from clear boundaries when those boundaries communicated confidence. He angled the rifle outward, aligning its length with the direction of the approaching shadow. The movement was smooth, controlled, without panic. The predator slowed. Calder felt the change more than he heard it. Hunger pushed lions towards risk, but instinct taught them caution. The rifle's shape, unfamiliar though non-threatening, created a disruption in the predator's expectation. Even a subtle hesitation mattered. The flame behind Calder wavered again, the glow catching on the edge of the rifle, as if marking the boundary between darkness and intent. The moment stretched, poised on the thin line between presence and engagement. Calder kept his breath steady, his posture unbroken. The forest stilled around them, the air holding tension like a drawn string. Then the shadow shifted direction. It wasn't retreat, it wasn't advance, it was adjustment, an instinctive recalibration of distance, speed, and possibility. The lion had recognized the barrier Calder presented. It had felt the steadiness in his posture, the confidence in his stillness, the structure behind him that limited approach angles. Hunger made predators bold, but it didn't make them reckless. The forest absorbed the movement, softening the lion's repositioning into a whisper of motion. Calder exhaled slowly, sensing that the charge had not been a commitment, but a test. The lion had felt the boundary and reconsidered the shape of the night. It wasn't gone, it wasn't discouraged, it was recalculating. He kept the rifle angled, his posture calm and grounded. The night remained balanced on a knife edge, and the next choice would determine everything. And as the clearing settled back into its layered silence, broken only by the faint flicker of ember light, Calder knew the lion's next move would not be a test. It would be a decision shaped by everything this moment had revealed. The clearing fell into a deeper quiet after the lion's measured withdrawal, a quiet so absolute that even the small flame behind Calder Brand seemed to soften its own crackle. The cold wrapped itself around the scene with a tightening calm, the kind found only in late winter mountain nights when every living thing held its breath. Calder didn't relax, he didn't shift his weight or lower the rifle. The moment after a test was often more dangerous than the test itself. In the wilderness, silence could be reassurance, or it could be disguise. Tonight, it felt like a veil, thin enough to see through, thick enough to distort what stood beyond it. He kept his posture steady, every sense focused outward while his thoughts worked inward. The near charge had not been a full commitment. It had been a probe, a deliberate, instinct-driven attempt to understand the boundary between predator and opportunity. Calder replayed the sound in his mind, the swift but calculated momentum breaking from the timber, the shift in trajectory at the last moment. That arc mattered. The lion had chosen reassessment over escalation, yet it had not retreated completely. Its hunger would not allow that. Hunger pulled predators back into possibility, even when caution shaped their steps.
Calder angled the broken rifle slowly, aligning it with the clearing's center as he allowed his breathing to deepen once more. The flame's reflection glimmered faintly across the barrel, a reminder that even small light carried meaning. Behind him, the ember gave off just enough heat to keep his fingers supple, but not enough to change the night's atmosphere. He had fed it sparingly, stretching the fat wood in thin increments. A larger flame might give comfort, but it would also give visibility. The lion was no longer simply watching the clearing, it was studying the subtle transitions of light and shadow, looking for patterns that revealed hesitation or fatigue. The forest remained still, but stillness alone did not tell the whole truth. Calder shifted his attention from sight to sound. The cold sharpened acoustics in ways that often surprised newcomers to the mountains. Distant cracks of ice sounded closer, small shifts in snow seemed amplified, but he had learned to separate the forest's natural movements from those shaped by something alive. Tonight, he listened not for noise, but for absence, places where sound should have been, but wasn't. Those blank spaces often held the answer. He detected one such absence along the tree line to the west. The wind had been brushing through the pines earlier, creating a soft, sifting whisper. Now the whisper had thinned unevenly, disrupted in a way that suggested something obstructing its path. Calder's eyes drifted toward that section of forest, though he moved his head only slightly. The dark timber beyond the clearing swelled into layers of shadow, dense, overlapping, impossible to read by shape alone. Yet he felt that the lion had repositioned there, not retreating, but observing from a new vantage.
He remained in place, grounded by discipline and by the knowledge that predators often required time to reorient after a failed approach. Hunger made them persistent but also strategic. The lion was deciding whether the boundary created by Calder's posture, the rifle's presence, and the ember's glow represented genuine strength or temporary advantage. The wilderness always evaluated confidence, and confidence often succeeded where force failed. Calder eased his grip on the rifle just enough to prevent his hands from stiffening. The cold could turn fingers rigid in minutes if tension took hold, and he needed responsiveness more than pressure. His breath slowed into deeper, quieter streams, each exhale disappearing quickly into the cold air. The forest remained unchanged for several long minutes. Even the snowfall had paused, as though the sky itself held its breath. These minutes were a kind of threshold, space where nothing moved, yet everything shifted. He allowed his thoughts to drift back to the snow around the clearing, recalling every track he had seen earlier. The lion's pattern had been a wide, consistent circle, gradually tightening through the evening. But the snow held more information than just movement. Track depth indicated fatigue. Snow compression patterns revealed weight distribution. The earlier prints had shown a slight unevenness, a softened edge on the rear pad suggesting the lion favored one side. Not an injury severe enough to slow it, but enough to shape its strategy. A predator with even a mild imbalance conserved energy differently, choosing paths that reduce strain. Calder's understanding of that detail shaped his sense of where the lion might move next. He rose slowly, only a few inches, shifting from a seated position to a half-crouch. The movement was fluid, steady, intentional. He remained close to the lean-to's entrance, allowing the shelter's structure to continue framing his silhouette. He didn't want to break the boundary too soon. The predator observed changes in outline more than changes in expression. Sudden enlargements or profile shifts could trigger response, but controlled, predictable movement signaled that Calder retained command over the space. He adjusted the rifle's angle, aligning it downward but ready. Even a non-functioning weapon held meaning to a predator. The shape, the length, the way it extended human reach, all of it communicated strength. Calder never underestimated the importance of such signals. Animals survived by interpreting gestures and stances long before humans did. He listened again, refining his focus until the forest's silence separated into subtle layers. The faint hum of distant wind, the soft creak of contracting trees, and the near imperceptible settling of snow. Then came a sound he didn't expect, a soft rhythmic muffling of snow deeper within the timber, not quick or aggressive, but steady. Calder froze. This pattern wasn't approach, it was retreat, or rather repositioning at a distance. The lion had moved away from the clearing's immediate edge, not in fear, but in recalculation. Hunger didn't always lead to immediate confrontation. Sometimes it pushed predators into patient strategies, waiting for fatigue, cold, or misjudgment to create opportunity. Calder lowered himself slightly again, relieved not in safety but in clarity. The lion was giving him space, though not surrendering the night. That space allowed for assessment, the kind that required calm rather than speed. He shifted his weight back inside the shelter, letting the ember's warmth touch his hands once more. The flame pulsed gently, the resin-scented aroma reaching only inches into the air. He studied it, aware that every decision ahead would depend on how long he could sustain this minimal source of heat. Outside, the clearing remained vast and unmoving, framed by the dark timber that held the lion's quiet presence. Calder rested his back against the reinforced wall, letting the structure support him without signaling exhaustion. He was cold, tired, aware the night had many hours left, but he was also clear-minded. His breath remained steady, his posture remained controlled, his awareness stayed sharp. A faint brightness touched the sky beyond the ridge, an early hint of dawn, too distinct to change the dark, but enough to signal that time continued moving. Light in the mountains arrived slowly, slipping across the land in thin bands before revealing the world. Calder understood that daylight wouldn't end the encounter, but it would offer new information. Tracks would appear with clearer definition, distances would reveal themselves, decisions would shift again. And as he watched the faintest trace of pale sky gather above the timber, Calder sensed that what dawn revealed would not bring closure, but a choice shaped by everything this long, suspended night had demanded from both predator and man. Dawn approached the mountains with a quiet patience, its first pale glow seeping across the ridge like a thin wash of silver. Calder Bran remained inside the lean-to, the last ember flickering faintly beside him, little more than a dying heartbeat of warmth. The forest around the clearing had begun shifting into the earliest movements of morning, subtle creaks of contracting wood relaxing, distant sighs of wind returning to the treetops, and the thin, scattered hush of snow settling under the softening sky. The lion's presence no longer pressed against the clearing with the same intensity it held through the night, but Calder didn't mistake that lessening for safety. Predators did not vanish with sunrise. They changed their timing, their angles, their options. He rose slowly, pulling the stiff weight of the broken rifle with him. His body protested the movement, stiff from hours of controlled posture, but he ignored the discomfort. The cold had settled into his joints and back, a deep ache that clung to each breath, yet clarity replaced exhaustion as the faint light strengthened. Dawn was not protection, but it was information, and information shaped advantage. Calder stepped carefully to the entrance of the lean-to, the cold morning air brushing against his face with a razor-like sharpness. He allowed the pale brightness to guide his gaze across the clearing, noting the textures and small disturbances that night had concealed. Tracks appeared clearly now, faint depressions where snow had been pressed under deliberate steps. They curved along the left arc of the clearing, then faded into the thick timber beyond. Calder crouched near the nearest set, studying the imprint with the same careful method he had applied years ago when learning to read the story of snow and shadow. The track edges were slightly softened, showing that time had passed since the lion made them. The depth told him the predator was fatigued. The spacing revealed a specific tension, a pattern of decision, hesitation, and renewed calculation. The lion had not moved blindly around the clearing. It had mapped angles, evaluated distance, and measured his posture from multiple positions.
Calder traced the snow lightly with his glove, identifying the subtle drag at the back of one print. It confirmed what he suspected during the night. The lion favored one side slightly. Not a major injury, but enough to shape its hunger into strategic restraint. Predators with minor imbalances often committed only when the odds leaned clearly in their favor. Last night, they hadn't, not fully. The broken rifle, the ember's glow, the reinforced shelter, each of these elements had combined to create an environment where the lion's risk outweighed its desperation. He rose from the tracks and made his way across the clearing, moving with slow, deliberate steps.
Dawn expanded the horizon, revealing subtle changes in color as blues shifted into muted grays, then into the first hints of gold along the ridge. The cold persisted, but daylight brought its own sort of warmth, not physical, but practical. Calder reached the tree line and paused, letting his eyes adjust to the depth of shadows still lingering inside the pines. He found another set of tracks leading away from the clearing, their angles purposeful, carrying the story of a predator withdrawing into the forest after a long night of evaluation. The lion had chosen to leave. Not because it was defeated, and not because it lost interest. It had retreated because the night had not given it the opening it needed. Survival in the wilderness was rarely a matter of triumph. It was a matter of timing, restraint, and recognizing thresholds. Calder absorbed that truth as he stood at the edge of the timber, the cold brushing past him in thin currents of wind that whispered across the exposed branches. He took a deep breath and stepped back toward the lean-to. The structure looked even more fragile in daylight, splintered beams, sagging cross-logs, and exposed joints that barely held together. Yet it had served as a barrier, a boundary, a place where strategy outweighed force. He dismantled the outer supports carefully, returning the clearing to a more natural state. The forest had given him shelter. It deserved the respect of restoration. Once finished, he packed his gear, sliding each item into place with the familiar precision of someone who understood that order was as essential to survival as instinct. The broken rifle lay across his pack, its weight symbolic now rather than functional. Tools adapted, purposes shifted. Even failure had value if repurposed with clarity. Calder paused before leaving the clearing, allowing the moment to settle into memory. Every night in the wilderness carried lessons, but not all lessons revealed themselves immediately. This night, however, shaped itself into something larger, an accumulation of choices and observations that formed the kind of frontier men passed down not through instruction, but through experience written in cold, hunger, and silence. He didn't speak the principles aloud. The mountains preferred quiet. But he felt them gather inside him nonetheless, clear and unbroken. He knew them well. Preparation mattered more than confidence. Stillness could be stronger than motion. Boundaries persuaded more effectively than force. Hunger shaped strategy, not chaos. Fire was not a cure, it was a message. Tools were only as strong as the mind using them, and the wilderness listened to intention long before it responded to action. These principles weren't trophies or triumphs. They were reminders, the kind that stay long after cold mornings faded and nights like this slipped into memory. Calder adjusted his pack straps and stepped beyond the clearing, entering the timber with a measured stride. The sky grew brighter overhead, the soft glow of sunrise filtering through the branches in narrow beams that followed him along the slope. The lion had returned to the deeper forest. The mountain watched without judgment, and daylight unfurled slowly across the ridge, carrying the promise of another long winter day. Calder didn't look back. The wilderness didn't require ceremony. It required presence, humility, and the willingness to learn from even the coldest, quietest hours. He walked with the understanding that survival wasn't defined by confrontation or victory. It was defined by the thin line between instinct and intention, shaped through choices made when the world narrowed to darkness, breath, and the quiet knowledge of one's place in the vast, unchanging wild. And as he descended the slope, the last trace of dawn catching the edge of his frozen coat, Calder Bran carried the night's doctrine with him, a collection of lessons written not in fear or triumph, but in the steady, unbroken discipline that kept him alive. Calder Bran left the mountain without glory or triumph, only a deeper respect for the thin boundaries that governed the wild. The night had not turned him into a hero, only into a man who listened more carefully to the silence that nearly claimed him. Somewhere in the timber, the lion continued its own fight against winter, both hunter and hunted in the same breath. and as Calder stepped into the pale light of dawn, he carried with him the quiet truth that survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most aware. If stories like this remind you why the American wilderness still has lessons worth protecting, don't keep them to yourself. Pass them along to someone who loves the frontier as much as you do. And if you want more nights like Calder's, more forgotten survival moments, and more true frontier grit, then stay close. Every week, the mountains open a new chapter, and you won't want to miss the next trail we uncover.